Hi, welcome to the Louie File. Today I'm going to talk to you about something that's I don't know, it's something that it's been being revealed to me as of late about angels, about fallen angels, and the real kind of a big role they play in our existence here as man in a fallen realm, in a fallen state. And it comes about, or it came to me in a rather unusual way. We've been studying 1 Peter, and we got to 1 Peter chapter 3, the ever so popular verses about wives being submissive to their husbands. But I started to see it in a fresh new way as I studied this chapter, 1 Peter 3. All right, so I'm just going to read the first few verses here, and then I'm going to jump a little bit ahead, and I'm going to try and show you what I was seeing in as few verses and as least amount of trouble as possible. I hope that you would write these verses down, that you would research this yourself. Don't just take my word for it. 1 Peter 3 starts off saying, "In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives, as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior. Your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God." All right, so we start off, the verse starts off in the first verse saying, in the same way, you wives, be submissive to your husbands. So I thought, well, that's continuation of the last chapter. So 1 Peter chapter 2 ends by saying that Jesus, even though he was reviled, he didn't revile in return, but it says he himself, let's see, 1 Peter 2, 22 and 23, "who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth, and while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously." So Jesus submitted himself to his Father. So now in chapter 3, Peter's telling us, in the same way, you wives do this with your husbands. So it's a matter of order. It's a matter of covering. It's a matter of protection. So Peter goes from wives, submit to your husbands. He said, even the ones that aren't obedient to the word, because your respectful and quiet and gentle spirit will win over those husbands. And he goes from being, he says they will observe your chaste and respectful behavior, and then he goes straight into your adornment must not be merely external. So he's saying your covering, you shouldn't depend on an external or outward covering, such as, you know, your hair being all made up and your gold and jewelry and all that. Now, I think lots of people have taken this and run with it in the wrong direction, saying women shouldn't have, you know, wear a lot of makeup or a lot of jewelry or short dresses or, you know, all of these things. I think that it's a little deeper than that. I think he's saying don't let that be what you think makes you beautiful. But on the other hand, he's also talking about coverings. See, he goes from being submissive to your husband, so he's saying get under the cover of your husband and don't let outward jewelry and hair be what you see as your covering. He goes on talking about the husband's role in living with the wives as weaker vessels so that their prayer won't be hindered. You know, husbands, treat your wives respectfully as the smaller of the two. And it says weaker. I mean, there's some women, obviously, that are stronger in other ways than just physical with their men, but that's neither here nor there. Let's jump on ahead in 1 Peter 3, starting at verse 18, he says, "For Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit." And then he says, "In which also he went and made proclamation to the spirits now in prison, who once were disobedient, when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah, during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who is at the right hand of God, Look at this. Having gone into heaven after angels and authorities and powers had been subjected to him. So, Peter starts off this chapter saying, wives, submit to your husbands. And he ends it talking about Noah and what was going on during the flood. I thought, well, how does he go from there to there? So, the key here was the angels. He's saying that what was going on during the construction of the ark is our key. So we would look back from there to Genesis 6 and see what he meant. But I want you to notice this first. He's saying that Noah and his family were saved in the ark through the water, just like we are saved by baptism. And he says not the washing off of your flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So what he's saying is the same thing the Apostle Paul told us in Romans 6, that we were baptized into Christ. And it's not really the water that is the point here. Noah and his family were not wet. They didn't get wet during the flood because they were kept in the ark. We, in turn, are kept in Christ. And Christ is now ruler. He's gone into heaven after angels and authorities and powers had been subjected to him. So, what is all this talking about? Well, let's look back now at 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And then we'll look somewhere else. 1 Corinthians 11, the Apostle Paul deals with this issue of being covered, the male, females, and coverings. Now I'm going to read several verses here. I just pray that you would look at this yourself. 1 Corinthians 11, verses 3 through 10. He says, "But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. Every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head, but every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head, for she is one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. For indeed man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake." Now look at this, verse 10, 1 Corinthians 11:10. "Therefore, the woman ought to have my Bible says, symbol of authority on her head because of the angels." What? Because of the angels. I would submit to you that this is not about wearing a scarf on your head. It goes on to talk about hair length on men and women. I don't even think that's really the issue. I think what the Apostle Paul is saying is very similar to what Peter is pointing at, and that is we have to be under the authority of our head, saying that God is the head of Christ, Christ is the head of man, man is the head of the woman. So he's saying here that a woman needs to have her head covered, meaning she has to have a husband or someone that is an authority over her in the structure, the authority structure, how God made it. He says, see, after all, the woman was made for man, not man for the woman. Very interesting. So there's always a covering needed. And it even says in there, it says, because of the angels. Wow. So, because of the angels. So what is this all about? Well, way back in Genesis chapter 3, we see the story of the fall of man, which was precipitated by Satan, or the serpent, a fallen angel that was tempting Eve to disobey God. Remember that? So the serpent says to Eve, "Oh, come on, eat of this tree, you'll be like God, your eyes will be open." So Eve partook of the forbidden tree and then gave it to her husband. So what was taking place? Well, Eve, the woman, was acting outside of her covering. She made a decision apart from her covering, Adam, and what happened? She wasn't covered, and an angel, Satan, took advantage of her, and the fall began. Now you might say it's not Eve's fault, it's the man's fault. Well, and you would be right. What would have happened if this would have worked in a different way is that Eve would have been tempted by the serpent or Satan, and she would have gone, uh-oh, and ran back to Adam, and she would have submitted herself to her husband, her covering, and then Adam in turn would have looked to God and submitted himself back to God, and the authority structure and the order would have been back in place. So, when the Bible tells women to submit to their husbands, a lot of times women get bent out of shape because they have bitten into this, excuse the pun, bitten into this women's lib thing that says that a woman should throw off the male dominance. Now see, we're missing the point here. God set up an authority structure, an order here on purpose for our well-being. I think of military structure. You have different ranks of authority in the military, and it's there to keep unity and to keep people alive. You know, what do they do in boot camp? They have them to march in formation. See, they don't want you getting out of line, not because they're just some mean tyrant trying to run your life because you can't run it yourself, but because they know the danger of getting out of line. So that's what we're primarily talking about here with these verses. Now, if you jump back into the New Covenant, back over here to 2 Peter, you will discover that this is not just some anomaly that's being talked about. 2 Peter, it's brought up again. 2 Peter 2, he is talking about false prophets and how God knows how to keep those people that are true, and he knows how to punish those that aren't. And he compares these false prophets, and he uses, not compares, I guess it's a comparison, but he's using angels as an example. So in 2 Peter 2 verse 4, he says, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness, reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, and if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example to those who would live ungodly lives thereafter, if he rescued righteous Lot, oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men, for by what he saw and heard that righteous man, while living among them, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day by their lawless deeds, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation." So he's telling us right here that there's some angels that are being held right now in a pit of darkness. I think one Bible translation says pit of gloom, reserved for judgment. Reserved for judgment. And then if you look over in Jude, the little 1-chapter letter right before the book of Revelation, Jude chapter 1, only chapter, verse 5 and 6, 7, 5, 6, and 7. It says, "Now I desire to remind you, though you know all things once for all, that the Lord, after saving a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe, and angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day." Left their angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode. Then he goes on talking about verse 7, "Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they in the same way as these indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh, are exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire." Wow, so there's some angels he's talking about here that didn't stay in their proper domain. They left it, abandoned their proper abode. And he says that it was just like Sodom and Gomorrah and how they went after strange flesh and exhibited an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. Wow. So, now, what is all this about? If you go back to Genesis 6, you'll see that it says that the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they produced a race of giants. The idea here is that fallen angels, sons of God, had relations with human women and produced evil offspring. So just like Jude says that these angels didn't stay in their rightful place, but went after strange flesh. So just like Sodom and Gomorrah, when men and women were engaged in all kinds of perverted sexual acts, they went after strange flesh. Oh my. It wasn't just gay and homosexual or lesbianism. It was much worse. Strange flesh. They went after sexual things with non-human, let's say, beings. So God had to destroy those cities. So you see, this is very much deeper than just a wife not having a right to her own opinion or whatever. So Peter in the Bible as a whole is telling women to submit to their husbands because the husband is supposed to submit to Christ, who is submitted to the Father. That's the goal. That's the order of events. In fact, the fall of man, what it really meant was that Adam, who was in charge of this planet, basically humbled himself and bowed down to a fallen angel, Satan, and he in turn became the ruler of this world. The prince of the power of the air, the ruler of this world. So what happened? Jesus, God in the flesh, had to come here. And in Hebrews chapter 2 it says he was made for a little while lower than the angels. Are you catching on to this? So God became a man, and not only a man, but he became a man that humbled himself, even to the obedience of the cross. So he became a man that was in our position. So it was God, man, angels. The fall turned it into God, fallen angel, man. So God had to become flesh, and had to not only become flesh and become human and be subservient, but he had to put himself under angels for a time. But it wasn't to stay that way. It was in order to overcome this fallen one by way of the death, burial, and resurrection. And when he did, he brought all of us in him, with him, through the death, burial, and resurrection. Now, according to Ephesians, he has seated us at the right hand of the Father in heavenly places. Astounding. So when you think about a wife submitting to her husband with all of the ramifications of that in play, it's pretty heavy stuff, isn't it? I just ask you to look into those verses for yourself. See if you don't come up with the same exact results that I did. Amazing, amazing thing that God is showing us in his word that we have missed. A lot of us have missed. All right, I hope this has enlightened you. I know it has me. I will talk to you next time on the Louie File.